Welcome to the Week of Evolution webinar series. We, as Bosch University Science Club Tree of Evolution Committee, collaborated with many scientists who are experts in their fields to present an evolution-themed series to you. We wanted to use the opportunities of the online platform to meet with the professors all around the world.
Our mission was always to spread accurate scientific information and create platforms where science can be freely discussed and told. When the conditions present in our country are taken into account, it's even more crucial to do so.
Therefore, we would like to restate the necessity for free academy as we still protest and stand against the appointed rectors and their undue sanctions.
Boğaziçi University members have been standing against this anti-democratic situation for more than a year.
Aside from that, this year we will have 9 seminars between 21st of January and 7th of February. You can also follow our social media accounts to be posted about the calendar.
Today, we will welcome Professor Marina from Columbia University. After she's finished with her talk, we will have a short Q&A session. You can ask the questions through chat and our team will edit and direct them to our professor.
Welcome again, Professor Kurtz.
Shall I get started?
Yeah, if you want, we can start.
Okay,
now we can see your slides too.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be invited by your student group. I really respect the initiative that you have taking advantage of these online platforms. I wish I could be with you in Turkey, but I probably wouldn't be able to fly there right now because it's the middle of the semester, and so it's wonderful to be there in a virtual platform. And I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my research on the behavioral ecology of primates. My general interest is in social behavior and social living. And I study animals that are very well known for being highly social, namely the non-human primates. And of course, we're primates too. That's not really the reason why I studied primates, but some people like to make that connection, then it's obvious that it's a reasonable connection to make in some ways. So today I want to share with you some thoughts on one aspect of social living, which is the competition that occurs between animals who live together. And it's based largely on my own long-term study of an African monkey, the blue monkey, which you see here. So let me introduce this topic by highlighting a fundamental characteristic of social living that's widely recognized based on decades of research. Simply put, living together is both a good thing and a bad thing. Ultimately, it involves a balance of benefits and costs. And the benefits typically derive from some form or forms of cooperation made possible by animals living together. But at the same time, group living can impose costs, such as greater competition or easier disease transmission. Most animals do not live socially, which probably reflects the fact that costs are often quite high. But successful group living animals have found an advantageous balance of benefits and costs, and we expect natural selection to favor those who do. In animals like primates that are evolutionarily committed to living with others, we expect individuals to experience a net benefit in terms of their lifetime reproductive success. The balance, in other words, is one in which, as shown here, the benefits outweigh the costs. So this diagram adds a little bit more detail to the picture. It comes from an article in Science by Peter Kapler, who was reviewing the selection pressures that are widely recognized as influencing social living in mammals. And the red box highlights how several ecological factors like the distribution and abundance of food, the presence of predators and pathogens act as evolutionary selection pressures that influence female spacing, that is, whether females are gregarious or whether they live solitarily. So predation pressure favors gregariousness, as animals can cooperate in predator vigilance or in defense. There's greater safety in numbers. I think that's easy to understand. Disease risk, as we now know so well with the pandemic, disfavors gregariousness. That risk is perhaps an unavoidable cost of animals living together. And the third one, food resources, can both foster group living, as when group members cooperate to defend feeding sites or a feeding territory, but they can also present costs when group mates compete with one another within their own group. And both of these things can actually happen at once. The rest of the diagram, outside of the red box, focuses on how male strategies map on to what the females are doing. Male strategies also include competition, but males compete primarily for mates. That males compete for mating opportunities has, of course, been appreciated from the times of Darwin, if not before. It's a result of the large differences in reproductive potential between females and males, especially in mammals where females gestate, they get pregnant, and they also lactate. But more recently, there's been a growing recognition of the prevalence and importance of competition among females. And in fact, primatologists were early to recognize female-female competition. In the 1990s, they had already developed models linking ecological variables to female social relations, focusing on that balance of cooperation and the cost of competition, and even distinguishing distinct effects of different types of competition. So I'm going to follow this track in this talk today. So how does one study competition? One option is to focus on aggressive contests, assuming that those contests are competition in action. The context presumably tells you what the contestants are competing over. And even if there's no obvious resource at stake, general harassment and intimidation may perpetuate asymmetries in power that give certain individuals a long-term advantage. In other words, dominant animals can stress others out at a fairly low cost to themselves. If aggressive contests occur often enough, we might identify regular patterns of winners and losers, and even a hierarchy within a group, and then we can use the rank position in that hierarchy as a proxy for success in contests, and see if or how it relates to fitness. But not all competition is aggressive. Animals also compete just by using up limited resources before somebody else can get to them. So that depresses their availability for others who suffer as a result. And this kind of exploitative competition, or scramble competition it's sometimes called, should manifest in an experienced density effect, which could be revealed by comparing individuals in larger versus smaller groups. So studies of Cercopithecine primates have contributed much to our understanding of aggressive and competitive relationships, especially studies of baboons, some macaque species, and also vervet monkeys. These taxa are well studied because they're relatively accessible to observers. They live in relatively open areas, and they also show strong asymmetries in individual contests. They're clear winners and losers, but also at the dyadic level, their relationships show clear asymmetries. You can see that in the middle image where the arrows are meant to represent aggression given to somebody else. So animal A gives a lot more aggression to B than vice versa. And those relationships, those dyadic relationships in a group are often transitive. And that's what the image on the right is meant to show you, that if A outranks B and B outranks C, then A also outranks C, and so forth and so on. So there's usually a pretty clear hierarchy. It's a very obvious feature of the patterning of agonistic interactions within the groups of these animals. And clearly, we know from lots of years of study that agonism and rank matter a lot to the lives and fitness of these animals. Anybody setting out to study a new population would think to ignore this variable. They would definitely include it in their study. So these well-studied taxa are sometimes seen to be rather iconic of what's typical for all Cercopithecine monkeys, or even what's typical for all so-called old world monkeys, or all primates in general, or even all social mammals. But I want to say that this particular collection of species that's well studied is not actually representative of the primate family tree, either taxonomically, ecologically, or socially. The forest-dwelling guenons that I study are also Cercopithecine monkeys. There are about 25 different species of them. You can see that they're quite a colorful lot. And I often find myself comparing what I know about them from studying one particular exemplar of this set of species by comparing those blue monkeys to their better known relatives. And this actually comes naturally because I started out studying macaques as an undergraduate. I also studied them as a postdoc, and I thought that guenons would be quite similar. But it often seems that the blue monkeys that I study are doing things differently, that they haven't really read the book that was written based on these other species, and that's especially true in the realm of competitive behavior. In fact, the other species have often contributed to what in the literature is described as the Cercopithecine model, but it's a very incomplete model if it really is supposed to represent what's going on in this group. So these differences, which I will show you and go through today, raise some further questions. Why do social systems vary? Are blue monkeys simply odd exceptions? Or have we maybe rushed prematurely to identify broader primate patterns? So I'm going to focus today on competitive relationships among female guenons, the ones that I study, by examining these two questions. How does success in contests affect individuals? That would be a way of measuring contest competition. And secondly, how do differences in local density, namely the size of groups in which they live, affect individuals, which is a way of assessing exploitative or scramble competition. But before I get into the data that answer these questions, I want to give you a brief introduction to the species and also to the study site. So the African guenons, the genus Cercopithecus and a few others as well, live mainly in the forests of sub-Saharan Africa. And Cercopithecus mitis, the particular species that I study, is actually polytypic. You can see that there are many subspecies. It has a particularly wide geographic area going all the way from Angola, Central Africa, up into Ethiopia, even down into South Africa here. As I said, there are multiple subspecies, all of which live in forests. The types of forests vary a little bit depending on where on the continent they're located, but all of them are primarily arboreal, although they may come down to the ground for short stints. They also generally appear to be dietary generalists. They're flexible feeders that prefer fruits, but they also eat a lot of leaves and spend a lot of time feeding on insects as well as main dietary items. And you can see that there's considerable variation across populations and studies in what they eat. So, for example, fruits comprise anywhere from 15 to 91% of the diet. So that's a huge amount of variation, and similar figures for leaves and prey, the main items there. Most of their calories, at least in our study population, which is Kakamega, listed there on the right, 128 different species of plants contribute to their diet there, and most of their calories come from fruit. This particular table is showing the amount of time spent on different items. That's not quite the same thing as how many calories they actually get from those items, but fruit in Kakamega contributes 56% of the calories that they ingest and leaves about 25%. So the population I study inhabits a rainforest in western Kenya at the end of this red arrow. The biota here are not typical of East Africa. You usually think of East Africa, you think of savanna woodland and flat-topped acacias, but this is a real rainforest. It's more similar to Central Africa with some Afro-montane elements because the elevation here is 1,600 meters, so it's relatively high. And the forest receives, on average, about 2,000 millimeters of rain per year, so it's really quite wet. There is some variation from year to year, and you can see that there's also some seasonal variation, with the months of January and February right now being relatively dry, and then a peak in April and May of rainfall across the years, and another peak in August and September. But except for the 2 dry months of January and February, the forest is always very wet underfoot. The leaves don't crunch under your feet. It's very green all year round. Even in the dry season, it's still green. So on the ground, it looks like this. On the right, you see one of my former graduate students on one of the trails for the forest, so you get a sense of how dense the vegetation is, even at ground level. And on the left, you see a kind of bird's eye view from Google Earth of the study area, which is in that yellow ellipse. And you can see that it's kind of on the edge of the forest, and there are a variety of different forest types in here. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. For example, this is some plantation forest. This is secondary growth. This is relatively undisturbed areas. So there's a variety of stuff, and a couple of roads and paths that go through the study area. And when you're on the ground making observations, you're often looking through a lot of dark leaves and seeing just a very little bit of the monkey that you're trying desperately to identify based on some of its natural features. Fortunately, we can sometimes see better than this. So I want to pause here just for a moment to acknowledge the many people who were and are part of my field team, which includes local people and students, numerous graduate students who contributed some of the results that I'm going to report, and also local institutions in Kenya that acted as sponsors or gave permission for this project to continue for over 40 years now, and also multiple sources of funding over the years. None of this would have been possible without the input of all these individuals and these institutions. And the photograph shows you my current field team, who have been with me since I think about 2006, and they're just fantastic. So this graph shows the groups in the study population, and the y-axis shows you group size, the x-axis shows you time, and it shows how their size and number has changed over about 25 years. It begins in 1994, which is when we first had good counts of the groups. And the groups have generally varied from as few as 9 individuals to more than 70 individuals, but they tend to split when they get big. And each vertical dotted vertical line here in red shows one such group split. So for example, here in the first dotted red line, the green group ceases to exist, and it splits into a yellow and a blue group. And over here, the purple group ceases to exist, and it splits into a red and a blue group here. So over time, you can see that the groups seem often, I mean, there are some exceptions, but the general trend is to increase somewhat in size and then to split, and then the new groups also tend to increase in size. The interesting exception is this very small group here, which formed from a fission. And now we have some other small groups as well that's retained a relatively small size and doesn't seem to be growing. And I'm not sure why that is yet, but it's an interesting phenomenon. But for our purposes today, the main point is that we've been able to expand over time the number of groups that we monitor, and to see groups with a greater diversity of group size. So the possibility of investigating what's happening to individuals in groups of different sizes is now possible. It wasn't really possible when I started the study back in the late 1970s, and I just had one group of a kind of, as it turned out, average group size. So blue monkeys live mostly in one male groups. Additional males sometimes can join temporarily during the breeding season. But the females, like in almost all Cercopithecine primates, are philopatric. So that means that they stay in the group in which they were born for the rest of their lives with their female relatives. Their young sons disperse at puberty. As they become sexually mature, they leave the group in which they were born. They go off and either invade a neighboring group. They usually don't do that immediately because they're not big enough, but they go off and live alone, maybe with one of their friends from their natal group. And once they've grown in size, they may try to take over a group and be the one male in that group. But from the female perspective, because that's what we're going to focus on today, the group contains several matrilines, so several female-defined families. And the females are also bonded with one another. That's what these pink lines are meant to show, that they have social ties with one another, and especially with their own relatives. So this figure illustrates how kinship relates to affiliation among adult females. Each one of these boxes summarizes the data for multiple dyads in each kinship class, from mothers and daughters to sisters to grandmothers. So from left to right, we're going from more closely related to non-kin, which are, if they're related at all, it's less than an aunt and a niece would be. And the reference line, the red dotted line, shows you the average female-female tie in a social group. So you can see that mothers and daughters have ties that are stronger than average. So do sisters, so do grandmothers and granddaughters. Aunts and nieces also exceed this average line, but the non-kin do not, because in fact most dyads in a group would not be related to one another. And the degree of bias, the degree of difference from the average, is higher the more closely related two individuals are. We also know that the degree of kin bias is strongest in larger groups, but that's mainly because those groups have more unrelated dyads in them, and that brings down the average value. So when you're comparing kin to an average that is lower because of all those unrelated dyads, it looks to be more impressive. So the females also cooperate with one another in territorial defense, and these contests between groups occur regularly every 2 to 3 days. Cooperating in these intergroup contests is, at a behavioral level, one of the most obvious signs of cooperation in a blue monkey group. And hoping that my video is going to play, I'm going to give you a sense of this. So you see the one group below, the other one up high, and they're shoulder to shoulder, vocalizing, lunging at one another. And sometimes this turns into real serious aggression where everybody piles on to another animal. We haven't seen deaths occur, but we've seen some pretty amazing injuries happening as a result of these encounters. Oops. So it's primarily the adult and older juvenile females who are involved in these encounters. So in the graph on the upper left here, it's showing you the percentage of individuals involved in intergroup contests as a function of age. So you see that infants are hardly involved at all, not surprisingly. And they become adults at about 7 years or older. So you can see that that there's an increase with age, and by the time somebody's an adult female, they're going, all adult females participate in these contests. In the graph on the lower right, you can see that female participation exceeds male participation at all ages. So the females are the black columns, the males are the lighter columns here. Again, age is the variable on the x-axis here, and you see that same trend with age, but a much faster increase with all the females, and females always participating more than males do. These individuals in this graph are all juveniles. The adult males very seldom participate in these fights. They usually sit in the background. They might vocalize a little bit. Every so often, if things get really hot, then they jump in and send everybody flying. But most of the work is done by the females here. So when females engage in agonistic interactions within their own group, so not between groups, now I'm switching to within group agonism, most of their interactions are quite mild. And so this photograph that I had on my title slide is actually not very typical. Here you have a female biting the tail of another one. But the graph on the right shows you the point that I'm trying to make here. So this is just showing the distribution of different types of agonistic interactions, and you can see that about half of them are rather subtle approach-retreat interactions. So that means one animal moves along, approaches another who leaves almost immediately within 2 seconds. And then we have another 22% that might involve some sort of threat. So that might be a vocal threat or a visual threat. 9% that involve spontaneous submission. So one animal just cowers or retreats without actually having been threatened. And only about 20% involve higher, more escalated forms of aggression like chasing or contact. Most of the agonistic interactions as well are dyadic. They don't involve two animals ganging up against one. Less than 1% involve coalitions like this. And when do they occur? Well, the within group contests occur mostly and disproportionately when the monkeys are feeding. So about 82% of agonistic interactions relate to feeding, which represents only about 39% of the time budget. In other words, food-related agonism occurs disproportionately. And if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that agonism is also especially likely when the monkeys are feeding on fruits, which are preferred foods for them, often clumped in distribution. They have a long depletion time, so you might expect the animals to be competing over fruits. The other two main items in their diet, namely leaves and prey, are contested less often than you would expect by chance. So both of these findings suggest that females are competing aggressively over food and particularly over fruit. So almost all the agonistic interactions, 96% of them, have a clear winner and loser. And we use these clear interactions to construct dominance hierarchies, considering the win and loss asymmetries within each dyad in the group, and then ordering the individuals accordingly. And that's what this figure represents here. These are data from a rather large group. All of the individuals listed here are adult females. Their counts of their interactions with one another have been binned over a period of 1 year. And the individuals have also been ordered both across the top and down here in terms of their dominance rank. So individual Pili is the highest ranking individual, Pincer is the second highest ranking, and Dingle here is the lowest ranking. So when you have clean hierarchical data like this, you tend to see most of your numbers in the upper half of this matrix, and the lower half, the numbers here, are generally smaller, they're generally sparser. These are cases of exceptions to the general pattern where there was one or two interactions that went against the general direction that winners and losers were occurring in a particular dyad. And you can see that the hierarchies, and this is just one example again, but in general, the hierarchies are significantly linear. You can test for statistical significance of the linearity, the transitivity of the hierarchies. There aren't very many reversals. There's moderate directional consistency, which expresses the degree to which all agonistic interactions go from a higher ranking animal to a lower ranking individual. That measure can vary between 0 and 1, and blue monkey hierarchies usually are at the upper end of that. They vary between about 0.7 and 1. This particular example here had a value of 0.9. So we have, good, pretty clear hierarchies here. And another thing to notice is that there's kin structure. So the different colors that I've used to code the individual names here tell you what family they belong to. And you can see that the members of the light blue family are the highest ranking individuals. And then we get the pink family. And then the green and the yellows are a little bit spread out. They're a little bit strange, but the yellows kind of spread out in there. Then we get the green and the light brown and the purple and the turquoise. And that's typical. Matriline members typically rank together in these hierarchies. Another thing about the hierarchies is that the ranks are generally of individuals are quite stable over time. So this graph here shows you data from one particular group, TWN, over a 15-year period from 2005 to 2019. And again, each of these individuals represents one each color here, each square represents one individual, and they have a consistent color across all the years. And I've also used the cool colors to represent the blues and the greens, one family, and the hotter colors to represent another family, because this particular group has two matrilines in it. And so you can see, for example, that individual Didge is the top ranking female across all these 16 years. Her sister Diamond was the second ranking female until she died in 2010. Their sister Annie was also high ranking until she died in 2008. And then we have another relative in this group, Amber, who begins to increase in rank. Most of the changes in rank are because an individual enters the group for the first time or because somebody died. But you can see that the blue family, as we went on, I had to add green color in here, is always at the top, and the pink family, the hotter colored family, is always at the bottom. So there's a lot of consistency in a female's rank over the course of her life. And both the female's rank and the size of her group influence the rate of agonism that she experiences. So this graph shows the rate of agonism given by adult females in 3 rank classes to all opponents. So the analyses actually use the ranks, but for the purposes of illustration, I've just grouped them into high, medium, and low ranking individuals. And what we see here is that females dish out more agonism. They give more agonism if they're higher ranking, and also if they are in larger groups. In fact, there's an interaction effect here. The degree of rank influence on agonism given is greater for females in a larger group than those in a smaller group. The rates at which females receive agonism are higher for low-ranking females. They receive it more often, and also higher for everybody in larger groups. So when you put that all together, you look at the total amount of agonism, both given and received. So how often do females participate in competitive interactions? It's higher in larger groups, and it's also higher for females of higher rank. And since agonistic contests can escalate and lead to injury, this is the cost of living in larger groups. So far this sounds maybe like a system with obvious contest competition that might be expected in a species with sizable groups, and one that prefers to feed on fruits, which are generally viewed as being sort of contestable resources, partly because they're clumped and they're monopolizable, and also because it takes a long time. You sit there for a while feeding in a place with fruits, and so your position can be usurped by somebody who's more powerful than you are. But in fact, the rates of agonism in blue monkeys in a comparative context are decidedly low. It's very difficult to find comparable rates, or I won't go into the details of that right now, but these rates are in fact comparable. The data were collected in a similar way, and they represent a number of different primate species, just ordered from left to right, from the lowest rates to the highest rates. And you can see that blue monkeys, the blue column, are certainly at the low end of this distribution. And I think this is probably how the species got its name, because Cercopithecus mitis, the word mitis in Latin, means gentle, mild, or placid. So they definitely seem to have been named appropriately. And especially when you remember that most of their agonistic interactions are also quite mild. They're just these displacements and supplants and approach-retreat interactions that also amplifies that impression of mildness. So, what are the consequences of differentiated rank for adult females? I mentioned before that agonism occurs disproportionately when the monkeys are feeding, and especially when they're feeding on fruit, which is a preferred resource. But there's no evidence that rank actually affects the amount of time spent feeding on fruit. In this model, we used several other predictors that were examined concurrently, including the availability of fruit and the size of the group and a female's reproductive stage relative to baseline, but really just focusing on the top where the X is there, I would just really want to focus on rank here. Rank did not have a significant effect on the amount of time spent feeding on fruit. And the time spent feeding on other main dietary items similarly showed these patterns. There were no rank effects on the amount of time spent feeding on leaves or feeding on prey. In fact, there was no evidence that rank affected any component of the time budget. And you may wonder if rank effects appeared only in larger groups. Maybe being high ranking has an advantage only if the group is relatively large. We looked for those sorts of group size rank interactions, but didn't find any. Now, of course, the time spent feeding on fruits, what was modeled here, is a measure of foraging effort. It may be a rather poor proxy of energy intake, but we also found no rank effects on energy intake on the bites per minute. This was another variable we measured. And my student, Marisa Takahashi, who you saw in a photograph earlier, for her dissertation, she actually analyzed the nutritional intake of these monkeys. And she also found no evidence that rank affects nutritional intake. So on the left here, you look at a model of the ratio between non-protein energy and protein, which is something that these monkeys conserve very well. But rank was not one of the factors that influenced this ratio in their nutritional intake. And in the right, you see the results of a model that looked at the intake of protein, of available proteins and not insoluble proteins. And again, we see that rank does not have a significant effect on this nutrient intake. So the nutritional analyses back up the analyses on feeding time. The best evidence that we have for rank mediating feeding competition comes from the work of another graduate student of mine, Stefan Forster, in which he measured fecal glucocorticoid hormones. So these are metabolic hormones, and multiple lines of evidence suggest that their levels are tied to energetics in blue monkeys. High levels of these hormones indicate energetic stress. So the levels of these hormones were higher for lower ranking females, but only when they were lactating. So those are the two figures in the red box. I think you can see in both of these figures a slight downward slope here compared to these boxes here. These are non-lactating females where there doesn't seem to be any pattern whatsoever. So when females are lactating, we see that the high-ranking females have lower levels and the lower-ranking females have higher levels. Similarly over here. And you can also see that the trend is more noticeable, or it's a steeper effect when fruit availability is low. So that suggests that high rank may be advantageous at particularly energetically stressful times. When a female is lactating, we think that's when they have the greatest energetic demand. And when, in addition, the fruit availability is low, given that fruit is a main source of their carbohydrates and their energy. Now, Stefan also looked at gut parasites, and he found that 71% of the females that he sampled were infected with a nematode, Trichuris, also known as the whipworm. And we know in humans that infection with whipworms can lead to considerable energetic stress that can even affect growth and development. Among lactating blue monkey females, fecal egg counts correlated negatively with rank. So higher ranking females had fewer of the eggs of this particular parasite. They seemed to be better off. So again, high rank seems to be advantageous when females are energetically stressed, because this effect was only true if the rank effect was there only if the females were lactating. Recently, I worked with an undergraduate student, Natalia Argeas, to examine the odds of injury for adult and large juvenile females during each month of their life. As before, our model included a number of predictors, but for the present purposes, I just want to highlight that again, there was no effect of rank, dominance rank, on the odds of injury. No evidence that rank affected the likelihood that a female would be injured or not in a particular month. So far I've talked about rank and behavioral or physiological variables that one might expect to be related to fitness. But we've also examined life history variables that indicate differential fitness more directly. And here you see data for the age at first birth, right? This is an important life history variable because it affects the length of a reproductive lifetime. Starting earlier, you probably have a longer time in which to reproduce. But I think it's pretty clear from this graph that there's absolutely no correlation between a female's rank and her age at first birth. Rank also doesn't correlate with her fertility. So in this study, we looked at the probability of conception. That's a measure of fertility in a given month for adult females. And we controlled for several factors like age, time since last conception, the lactation stage, time of year, and rainfall, all of these things that we would expect might influence fertility as well. So it was important to include them as control variables. But again, I want you to focus here on the effect of rank. We saw no evidence that rank predicted the likelihood of conception in a particular month when controlling for these other variables. And moving on now to some survival metrics. This is survival of a female's offspring. So we're asking whether the survival of her offspring is related to her dominance rank, integrated over the time in which the infant was alive. And the mother's rank here is broken down into tertiles here, so high, medium, and low in different colors. And this is a typical survival curve that shows you on the y-axis the percentage of individuals that are surviving over time, over years. And you can see that there is a drop-off in survival for all infants when they're young. Infant mortality happens. Infants are delicate. But the important thing is to note here is that there's really no difference in the infants of high, medium, and low-ranking mothers. These different colored lines all overlap with one another. So no evidence that a mother's rank influences the survival of her offspring. And a female's own survival. So instead of asking whether her rank influences her kid's survival, we can ask, does her rank influence her own survival? We also did not find evidence for this. So this is another survival curve here. And the estimates start at adulthood when we can assess a female's rank. And again, we see here the ranks of these females are broken into 4 different categories. If anything, it looks like the purple line, the highest ranking females are not surviving as well as anybody else. But in fact, if you do the analysis statistically, it tells you that there is no significant difference in survival of females dependent on their rank. So her own survival is not affected. So to summarize, really my answers to this first question, how does success in contests affect individuals? To summarize it in 2 words, I would say not much. The effects seem to be quite limited. There's no rank effect on diet, no rank effect on time budget. The percentage of time feeding on preferred fruits is not affected by rank, nor their nutrient intake, nor measures of fertility, nor the offspring survival, nor a female's own survival. We did see that high-ranking females have lower glucocorticoid hormones if they're lactating and food is relatively scarce, especially fruits. And we also see that they have a lower whipworm count, egg count, if they are lactating. So It seems a little bit puzzling, I think, these results, given that agonistic behavior allows a very clear status differentiation. What for? Why do they have these clear hierarchies? What good is it doing for them? And also, given that the data are so clear that the contests focus on preferred food. And because these results were so surprising, it actually took me quite a long time to believe them. I kept on thinking, well, I just don't have enough data. I need to keep on gathering more data points here. But the picture is so consistent across multiple measures of success, from behavior to physiology to direct measures of fitness like fertility and survival. So I now actually think that they do reflect the real picture in this species, but they led me to ask two follow-up questions. One of these is, why is status such a weak predictor of anything? What happens to the losers in these agonistic contests that happen in the feeding trees? And the second question was, maybe agonism is about something else other than food, fertility, and survival. Maybe we need to look at some other correlates. So let me take you down these two paths. What happens to the losers? Well, we collected some data from what happens to animals when they face these agonistic contests in the trees. And it turns out that it doesn't seem actually that it's that bad to lose. Almost half of the losers don't even leave the feeding tree. They might be displaced from the particular position that they're sitting in at one moment, but they don't actually leave the tree in which they and other individuals are feeding. And when they do resume feeding, about 63% of them within half a minute are eating the exact same food again. So again, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. They're not delayed much. They can still eat the same food. And another 12% of them will eat the same food in a little bit longer, within about 3 1/3 minutes. And about a quarter of them will move on to other food, and it takes them a little bit longer because they need to go somewhere else. So basically, there's not a lot of effect here. 80% of fruit feeders resume feeding on fruit, and about 62% of those resume feeding lower in the crown, but that's actually not, and the reason that I mentioned that point is because there has been some work on tropical forest trees that suggests that the fruits that are higher up near the top of the canopy, where they get more sunlight, have more sugars in them. They're better foods for that reason. They give more energy than fruits that are lower down in the crown of an individual tree. So we were interested whether the losers are forced to go to the lower positions. And more than half of them do go down, but it's actually not a significant difference from 50-50. So we don't really have evidence that their feeding is depressed in that way either. So one possibility here is that the rank effects on food-related behavior and fitness are weak because the disadvantage of losing is biologically tiny. It just doesn't really matter very much. And I wish I had other comparable data from other taxa where the rank advantage is stronger. But if you have a strong rank advantage, it doesn't really occur to you to ask what happens when an animal loses. For me, that question came up because of a sort of mismatch between the clear hierarchies and the fitness effects. The second possibility is that even though it looks like the females are competing over food, it's really direct reproductive competition. And this possibility arose when we examined how rates of agonism track a female's reproductive status. So the data came here from follows of individual females, and we looked at how the number of agonistic interactions relates to their reproductive state, whether they're sexually active, pregnant, lactating, or anything else. And we controlled for group size and a female's rank because we know that those factors influence the rates of aggression. So if you look at the cluster of bars on the left side, the pregnant females, yellow, the lactating females, blue, they direct more agonism to other adult females than those that are not reproductive, the gray ones. And that's consistent with agonism relating to access to food, to fruit, to energy, right? Because pregnant and lactating females have higher needs for energy than other females. But note as well that the red bar, which are the sexually active females, the females who are mating, they both give and receive. So here's the giving difference and here's the receiving difference, agonism from their peers at elevated rates. And the high rates in these sexually active females made me curious if maybe sexually active females are competing for access to males. Now, that might sound kind of strange, but remember in blue monkeys, they live in one male groups. So males can be seen as kind of scarce commodities. There's only one male and multiple adult females. They are seasonal breeders, so females are likely to be mating at the same time. And not only that, but adult male blue monkeys, as you can see in this photograph, regularly reject female sexual attention. So what you're seeing on the right side is a female giving a pucker face. This is what females do. They come up to males and pucker their lips in this way, and this is a signal that they're interested in copulating. And the male, who's a little bit fuzzy in this photograph, is looking away from the females. In fact, 80% of overtures made by females, solicitations to copulate with males, are rejected by adult males. So a sexually active female who harasses others may increase the likelihood that she gets to mate with the male that she wants, the male that she prefers. And that could explain why sexually active females are more likely to aggress against their peers and to receive aggression from their peers. I want to emphasize that very little of the female-female agonism of the sexually active females, again, the red bars here, was obviously about access to a mate. Only about 11% of it was, so that's this column over here. Most of it was related to feeding, which is the general pattern overall for all females, like I've shown you before. So altogether, these results raise the possibility that harassment in multiple immediate contexts has effects that stretch beyond those immediate contexts. Females may harass others while they're feeding to benefit reproductively. I realize that I haven't demonstrated a fitness advantage to siring offspring with a preferred male. That would certainly round out such an interpretation. So to recap on question 1, this is where I want to leave things. How does success in contests affect individual females? No effect on diet, time budget, nutrient intake. May affect health and well-being at crunch times, but rank has no effect on fertility, survival, and infant survival. It might be related to the easy recovering from received agonism in fruiting trees, and it might affect sexual access to preferred males. So let me turn now to the second question. What about this kind of competition that can be revealed through density effects? We might expect females in larger groups to spend more time feeding if the extra mouths to feed means that there's more competition for food. And indeed, they do. Females in larger groups spend more time feeding and more time grooming and less time resting and moving. And these are the 4 main things that take up their time budget. Reduced moving isn't really what we'd expect for frugivores. There's lots of data on other species that suggest that animals in larger groups need to push on to keep on going because they deplete a local feeding area sooner. But that doesn't seem to be happening here. And if we look at data on travel distance, they also fail to show that larger groups are traveling farther. This is a smaller data set. It came from the daily travel distances over full days of observations of groups during a 6-month period. So we have 3 different groups here from left to right, from smallest to largest in terms of the number of individuals. And what you're seeing here is the median daily travel distance and the interquartile ranges for these groups of different size. And you can see that there's no clear group size effect here between these 3 groups. It is important when you're comparing groups like this to make sure that you're also taking into account the fact that the habitats of the three groups might be different from one another. For example, if a large group lives in a better quality habitat, they may not have to move farther to get what they need. And so these yellow numbers at the top are a measure of habitat quality. They're the basal area of food trees. So, how much food is being produced in these different home ranges of these different groups. And the larger the number, the better quality. So you can see that in this particular data set, the smallest group had the best quality home range. If anything, then the largest group, TW, should have been suffering, especially not only because they were big, but also because they were in lower quality habitat. And so they should have had to move more quickly. But in fact, you don't see any pattern like that here. And these results, which were travel distances taken at the group level, have since been confirmed by my student Marisa Takahashi, who had individual trajectories of individual females in groups of different sizes, and found again that group size was not a predictor of how much the individual females move. And we think the reason for this is because the big groups spread out more. The large groups, the individuals can be spread over 200 to 300 meters end to end in the forest. I mean, when you're with them, you hardly have a sense that there's a group at all. It just seems like monkeys scattered over a really large distance. And you can see that phenomenon here using data that were collected by one of our Kenyan interns, Alan Adembo, who measured the group spread 20 to 30 times per group for groups of different sizes. And you can see that as the group size increases, going from left to right here, the spread, this is the results of the model, also increases. So the advantage of living in larger groups is evident when we consider the between group contests, these territorial contests. And the top graph here in red shows you that the odds of winning increase the more that one group outnumbers the other one. So if there's a discrepancy in size between groups, the bigger group is likely to win. And so if you're a large group, you're more likely to outnumber your opponents around you, your neighboring groups, and that's an advantage. I'm going to skip the other two graphs here. They just make the point. There are other factors that predict success, but we're interested in group size. And here, from the perspective of access to food, living in larger groups also seems to bring both modest costs in terms of higher rates of food-related agonism and more time feeding, less time resting, but also some benefits in terms of between-group competition, as I've just shown you. So how do they play out? How do those two factors play out on individual fitness? Well, we haven't found a group size effect on survival at all. But our model for conception probability, which I mentioned earlier, which is a measure of fertility, again, controlled for age and reproductive history and various environmental factors, showed, as you can see here, that females are most likely to conceive if they live in a group of intermediate size. The peak of this curve is at about a group size of 31 individuals. That seems to be the group size that optimizes the likelihood of conceiving in a particular month. So if conception is related to condition, body condition, and intermediate size groups offer the most favorable cost-benefit ratio, it seems that they don't have too much within group competition, but enough between group clout to be able to succeed in competition with the neighboring groups. And in fact, the data on the group splits suggest that that makes sense here. So from the here you see where we might predict a group would split a little bit more than 50 individuals. The fertility rate is going to start dipping down to a pretty disadvantageous rate. And so we would expect females not to want to live in groups greater than 50 some individuals. And if we look at the data on these group splits, we see that there is some evidence that blue monkeys meet this expectation. So the red numbers here show you the size of a group before it split. So these are just across the years now, different study groups. Here was one at 46 individuals. It split into two smaller groups, 61. And you can see, I mean, there's some variation in the size of these groups, but the average of all the sizes of groups at the time they split is 48 individuals, which is pretty close to that value of 50 plus that I just showed you. And we also know behaviorally that these fissions are engineered by the females. The daughters will divide up the original home range. And this is a moment when group size also matters, as the larger group in the fission usually gets a larger chunk of the original group's home range. So to summarize the main points, and I'm almost done here, on group size, we see that females in larger groups face modest within-group competition costs, but the larger groups have an advantage in between-group contests, and the fertility is highest in intermediate-sized groups, which reflects probably this balance between within-group costs and between-group advantages. So overall then, blue monkeys seem to be a species in which the costs of competition are perhaps moderate and related more to density effects than they are to direct contests. They do seem to deserve their Latin name Midas, gentle or placid. Why they are different in these ways from their more iconic relatives remains an open question. But the differences might relate to their arboreal lifestyle in a really three-dimensional rainforest. It's very tall. It allows them to spread out in 3 dimensions. There's a great diversity of feeding options for them, which they're also physiologically capable of handling. And it includes a lot of leafy material, which tends to be consistently available and can serve as a fallback food when their preferred foods are not around or they can't get to them. I'm still puzzled by their strong linear hierarchical relations, but perhaps they're an evolutionary vestige, or maybe the power that some individuals have over others is simply used to avoid frustration. If you have power, you're not frustrated in getting what you want when you want to have it. I would think that that would be a very basic, primitive animal motivation. So I want to close with this slide to give a few broader thoughts that the study of blue monkeys contributes to a more general view of competition in social animals. One of them is that asymmetries in agonistic behavior don't imply strong rank effects on behavior or fitness. We always have to measure those effects explicitly. We shouldn't make assumptions, but people do make assumptions all the time that if they have clear hierarchies, that the high-ranking individuals are going to be more successful. We need to demonstrate that directly. Secondly, differentiated social status may affect health and well-being at crunch times, but still fail to predict reproductive rates or survival over long lifespan. This is really a shout out to the value of long-term studies, especially when one's subjects live for a long time. Maybe there are disadvantages in certain years, but everything gets evened out over a lifespan. The third point is that the immediate context of aggression may not be what it's really about. So aggression that looks to be over food might be a more general form of bullying and may ultimately limit access to mates. Again, we shouldn't make assumptions. We should actually investigate them. And finally, the optimal intermediate group size reflects a balance of costs and benefits of both within and between group competition. So the larger groups have an advantage in between group contests, but their members face more indirect or scramble competition than those in small groups. As such, neither extreme is actually optimal, and yet they do occur. So that's my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Professor Kortz. It was really interesting, expectedly, and really informative as well. If it is suitable for you too, we can move on with a short Q&A session. Our moderator team will direct the questions from our audience. If it's okay with you.
That's fine. Yeah, sorry, I went over a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
I'm seeing that now.
I'm going to start, but first I would like to thank you very much for your informative presentation too. My question is, how is the main herd divided into different groups in terms of the distribution of the number of males and females? Can we correlate this division into the competition between adults?
So was the second word herd, the main herd?
Yes, how is the
Yeah,
main
okay.
herd divided?
So I'm going to assume that, okay, so I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by herd there, but the population is divided into social groups. So each social group has one adult male in it and multiple adult females and the offspring of those adult females. And the female offspring will stay there for their entire lives. The male offspring will leave when they become the equivalent of teenagers, when they hit puberty. So that's why I'm focusing on females. They're sort of the consistent members of these groups. The males, of course, also compete to be that one male in the group. And I haven't talked about that at all today. But you can imagine that if there's roughly a 50-50 sex ratio, then for every male who's in the group, there are quite a few males who are not in a group at all. And they're living solitary lives outside of groups. They don't even band up with each other. They just live kind of alone. But we don't know much about them because they're very difficult to study. It's hard to find them. They have a very secretive, cryptic existence in the forest. But they will come sometimes and try to take over a group of females from the current resident male, and then you have a lot of aggression between those males that are competing with one another. So the males are mainly competing for mates, for opportunities to be the one male in a group of females. If they make it into that group, it's interesting. I mean, there's a whole nother story. They do sire most of the kids, but about 40% of the kids that are born when a male is the resident male of a group are not his. So he cannot monopolize a group very well. And that's partly because of the females again. They have their own preferences for which males they like, and they will sometimes go off to the edges of their group and sneak around with somebody who's lurking on the edge and mate with him. And those males will be able to sire some of the kids.
Okay. Thank you very much again.
Mm-hmm.
So I can go on with the other question. First of all, I want to say thank you for your great presentation and talk. And the question is that, can we say that females have greater flexibility in blue monkeys than males in establishing inter- or inter-organizational relationships in social organizations?
That's an interesting question. I guess in a way, the females are controlling the social organization overall because they live together in groups. They determine the size of the groups. Like when a group splitting is the main way that they can affect the size of the group in which they live. They don't kick animals out, but they can decide to split into two. And the females are all about that. The males are not really very involved. So the males kind of have to join into a social structure that's set up by the females. So the males will join a group of females when they can. I mean, they have to fight their way in, of course. And they're kind of given the social structure, whereas the females are the ones who are determining it. So I think in a way that's correct, especially in the way that females control group size. And females presumably also have some control over the network of social ties, both affiliative and aggressive, that occur within a particular group because they make choices. Each individual makes choices of her own about who she's going to socialize with, who's going to be her friend, and who's not going to be so much of her friend. So I think that's correct.
Thank you for the answer. And there's a last question here. The question is that, when are the influxes in blue monkey groups and what factors trigger the process?
So these male influxes, they occur mostly during the breeding season, which you might expect because that's when females are sexually active. So a male coming in has many opportunities. And they happen in about 25% of breeding seasons across the years in the groups. They are more likely to happen in larger groups, which is not unexpected because the resident, if you imagine the group before the influx, there's one male and multiple females, and now the breeding season is coming along, the females are becoming sexually active. And that one male has trouble. He has trouble mate guarding all those females because we're in a dense forest. The groups are spread over 200 or 300 meters. He can't be everywhere at once. He can't see what all the females are doing. And as I said before, the females have their own agenda here. They sometimes seem to get tired of the same old guy, and they're really interested in these newcomers who appear on the edge of their group. So we have shown in systematic analyses that the larger groups are more likely to have these influxes, and we think it's because the mate guarding is just too difficult for a resident male in those bigger groups. If you're dealing with a small group of 10 individuals with just 2 or 3 adult females, that group is likely to, everybody can sort of see everybody else all the time. A male like that's not likely to be invaded by other males in an influx. So I think that's what one would expect commonsensically, and that is in fact what happens. There could also be factors that relate to the individual power or prowess of particular males, but of course that's a much more difficult thing to measure. We don't have a direct way of assessing that, but it wouldn't surprise me if certain males are just sort of weak, not able to intimidate others, maybe not as bold or as confident, maybe because they're younger, but we don't have direct evidence of that.
Thanks again. It was the last question, so the Q&A session is over now.
I think we should stop here because of the limited time interval. Thank you again, Professor Kurtz, for we deeply appreciate for your contribution to the series. It was very enjoyable for me, especially as I am interested in primatology. Thanks again so much. Hope to see you again in another talk.
Well, thanks again so much for inviting me, and it was really a pleasure.
See you.
Bye.
You see.